Hello, I'm Chuck Wolf, Chief Executive for Charles J. Wolf Associates, LLC. As a motivational speaker and a leadership consultant and executive coach and trainer, I often work with very successful people in their companies. Since many can't afford a professional, I volunteer to host a radio talk show called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel, on a nonprofit community radio station in Bridgeport, Connecticut, WPKN. My reason for doing the show is to share with as many people as possible this wonderful process for helping people manage their own emotions and their relationships with others. My goal is for everyone listening to learn to use the Emotion Roadmap to make life better. As you listen to me, help others, I hope you are also learning. As a Simsbury resident, I'm delighted to be able to make the show available through Simsbury TV. To learn more, go to my website, www.emotionroadmap.com. Thank you for listening and watching.
Hello, I'm Chuck Wolf, and you're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM, listener-supported radio in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I'm filming this program from my home since the studio is still off limits for me because of the COVID-19 virus. But we also have an election coming up at this point, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of emotional intelligence in my show, The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. The show is all about helping people enhance relationships, manage emotions, and learn the power of empathy. It's about taking control over how you're feeling and how you want to feel, and what you hope happens with your relationships with the people that mean the most to you. And we've struggled over these last 4 years, and beyond that, really, seemed to get really much more nasty when President Trump got elected, but it's been hyper-partisan for a long time. But I don't remember ever seeing relationships struggle so much as they have in the last 4 years. I've seen family members, I've seen friends lose touch with one another because of their politics. And that seems so wrong to me. When I think about the idea of the show, when I began doing these shows 11 years ago, it was with the intent to help people to take the wheel and control how you feel, and also help you to influence, not necessarily control, but influence how others feel. And so I want to take some time in this particular moment in time to go through some of the lessons and opportunities that I've shared over the years by being able to bring to you not only my own thoughts about emotional intelligence, the new science that was brought to us by the president of Yale University, Peter Salve, and University professor of psychology, Jack Mayer, in 1990. Those are the two people primarily responsible for this notion that there's an intelligence out there involving our emotional abilities. And I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about that with you. And I want to hope that you use those abilities, particularly those of you who have been listening for a long time, to your advantage in helping the world navigate what's going to be extremely challenging circumstances on November 3rd when our election takes place. Because I don't know if we're going to know who the president is. We are already overwhelmed emotionally by what's happened to everybody with the COVID-19 pandemic that we've all experienced. There have been so many questions and uncertainties, so many issues revolving around family relationships and dynamics. For the longest time in my own family, we felt we couldn't see our children or our grandchildren without putting ourselves at great risk. We have relatives who lost loved ones who could only look at them through a hospital window and not go in and contact them as they were dying. these have been challenging times that we are not used to. Now, there's a lot of people on this planet that do without a lot of staples, that don't necessarily have homes. We have homeless in this country. We have people that don't get enough food to eat, or clothes and shelter are missing. There are so many challenges for so many of us that those of us who find ourselves in better circumstances might wonder, well, why should we not be able to cope just with not seeing some people for a few months? That seems reasonably easy to keep from infecting others and causing someone else's death or our own. And yet, we're by nature a species that likes to be together with loved ones in particular. Now, some people tend towards introversion. I'm sort of borderline around introversion, extroversion, but I lean a bit towards being introverted. And so for me, actually seeing people on Zoom, seeing a few loved ones on occasion, that's okay. I'm not as desperate as others who find themselves getting their energy from being around people. And there are people in my own life who really struggle with not being with others, leading to depression. You know, there was a French philosopher who once said, sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. Now, people will argue that nothing's worse than this disease, but we have seen people not go for medical appointments for other diseases because they're afraid of catching the virus. We have seen drug addiction, domestic violence, issues associated with these terrible experiences increase. Child abuse is on the increase. Violence in our cities is on the increase. There are just lots of things that have been happening all at the same time we're dealing with this virus. Should we send our kids to school? Should teachers go and teach? Should workers go inside drugstores or supermarkets or post offices or barber shops? Should anyone go to work? In some ways, we have expectations that people should go to work. Otherwise, how are we going to have our groceries? We even on occasion will get a takeout meal, although we're not ready to go yet to eat at restaurants. What about wearing masks? At one time, masks were essential, and then they weren't, and then they were again. I think mostly people have taken to believe that masks are probably a pretty good idea these days. But do we shame people if they're not wearing a mask? Seems like that's happening. On top of already finding political reasons not to like one another, if we're not a mask wearer or a believer in some of the scientists, as opposed to other of the scientists, we struggle with what to know is truth. Is what we know politicized? It seems like it might be. Are doctors the ones who should decide if we lock down our cities and towns and states in the country? As a leadership development specialist, as someone who knows that leaders will often have to listen to people about risk that they may take in their organizations, I know that lawyers will often argue for caution. That's what lawyers get paid to do inside organizations, lawyers that work for those organizations. I know that scientists make educated guesses based on data analysis, and that those guesses serve as science until new data comes in and says that the old data wasn't right, and then new science emerges. So when we say we've got to believe in the truth, It's sort of hard to know sometimes what exactly is the truth. So it seems to me, if you're able, and you're in a protected class because you've got something that's a problem, a potential problem, a health problem of some kind, that you want to have as little exposure to other people as you possibly can. And that's not that difficult for where I live, in my circumstance. I've got to believe for a lot of people in the inner city who live on the 19th floor in an apartment building, for people that are in tenements, in close quarters, living with lots of others who have to go to work, so that there's an enormous mix of people who they've seen coming into your home every night. Not so easy to self-quarantine. And there are so many challenges with families, with children who haven't been to school, or who are going to school part-time or half days, or doing everything remote, depending on where they live. How is a parent to serve as a teacher while also having a full-time position or even a part-time position? What if there's one parent in the home, not two? And even if two parents are there and they're both working and they have several children, how does it all work? It's challenging. They say necessity is the mother of invention, so we're finding ways to make things work. Maybe not so well, and often through trial and error. I think we've learned some things about pandemics, and I'm hoping that people will take the time to step back and say, how do we be smarter about what we do next? I'm appreciative of all the efforts that everyone is making, all the people in healthcare, certainly. The people that have delivered groceries to the back of my car so that I don't have to go into a shop on my own. I'm appreciative to the Postal Service and UPS and FedEx that bring us what we can't get locally. I'm appreciative to all those people who are taking care of other people's children. I'm appreciative of all the teachers back in school, and recognize that some of you can't go back because you have existing conditions that will threaten your life, and you have to be sensitive to your own personal needs. And you are probably someone that matters a lot to your families too. So there's no black and white here for me. There's just lots of gray. One of the things that I'd encourage you to do as you're thinking about how to cope more effectively is take a look at some of the other shows I put up. You can find much of what I've done in recent times on YouTube. Because I've done a lot of Zoom presentations with really fascinating people, you can find at Emotion Roadmap, Chuck Wolf and Emotion Roadmap, and my leadership playlist, you'll find a conversation with Mark Brackett, where Mark talks about strategies that he and his colleagues at Yale University, where Mark is the director of the Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence, have come up with a multitude of ways of helping you cope during these times. You'll see an interview with a friend and colleague of mine, David Caruso, who is the co-author with Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer of what's called the Mesquite. The Mesquite is the Mayer-Salovey-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test. In the late 1990s, David asked if I would work with himself and with Peter Salovey and with Jack Mayer to help them take their ability model, their emotional intelligence ability model, and make it useful. That's where the Emotion Roadmap comes from that initial venture with those three authors of the Mesquite, the test that measures emotional abilities, actually helped to create the first certification program for that test, to teach other people how to use it, how to assess emotional abilities. But you'll see in a recent summer show that I did for PKN, you'll see on YouTube, David and I talking about our ideas about how do you use what we've learned from the emotion roadmap and from what David calls the emotion blueprint to determine how you can use these new learnings about emotional intelligence to manage the depression you might be experiencing or help somebody else overcome their sadness or aloneness, how to increase your feeling of belongingness, how to generate community via Zoom and other media technologies. One of the wonderful things that's happened in recent times in this year is that one of our daughters, we have 3 daughters, they're grown, they're all married, 2 of them have children, so we have grandchildren, one's on the way. But one of the things that we've been doing very, very often these days is we have, with Facebook, and using Facebook Messenger, a group meeting, often in the afternoon, late afternoon, where our 3 daughters and their families and my wife and I get together. We have a video chat. It is quite lovely. It is quite lovely. So that's one of the things you can do to try and engage with people you love. Another way to keep your community alive and well is to have a similar kind of conference using social media, whether a Zoom account or Facebook or some other means, to chat with friends, maybe friends in long distances, places you haven't seen in quite some time. That reminds me, I owe someone a call, someone that is in Singapore that is a good friend of mine. And we were trying to find a date where we could get together. I was very busy, she was very busy, but I think it's my turn to write back to her. So I'll do that when this show is over. So think about who you haven't seen, who you'd like to see, and how will it make you feel when you call them, when you Zoom them, or you use Microsoft Teams or some other strategy. But again, Facebook doesn't cost, and you can do a Messenger. And that's pretty awesome, actually. WhatsApp is an app you can put on your smartphone that you can do that. You can use that as well. You have a video chat with someone that's meaningful to you, that will make a difference in your life. So think about who you want to contact, how they'll make you feel. Sometimes when I'm teaching in a program, I take the time to look at what it is that will help people to manage their emotions. Because it's unfortunate that we don't really learn a whole lot, except through trial and error for most of us, how to manage emotions, our own and others. And yet, there are lots of actual skills that you can learn that you may not have learned. But if you want to look at some of the shows that I've done, and you can find my shows, as I said, on YouTube. You go to YouTube and Emotion Roadmap, you probably come up with the Simsbury Community Television, which has been quite a few of my shows over many years. More recently, though, this summer, if you go to my own page, Chuck Wolf Emotion Roadmap, you type that in, and you'll find my page. If you can't find it, by the way, you can find it by writing me an email, and I will send you a link to my leadership playlist. But anyway, those are more recent shows. But on Public Radio Exchange, if you type Public Radio Exchange is a place where, as someone who works in community radio, nonprofit radio, as I have done for 11 years, I've taken a number of shows that I thought came out really well, ones that I really thought were useful to share with people so that others might see them, or someone could listen again if they liked it a lot when they first heard it. And I think you'll find a lot of topics. I'm able to take a paragraph or two and explain what the show's about, so you get a pretty good sense of that. For instance, if you wanted to learn about emotional intelligence, the history of it, with Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer and David Caruso, how their seminal article that was peer-reviewed, that got published in 1990, Jack and Peter's article about emotional intelligence, was really it really didn't get much attention until in 1995, 5 years later, Dan Goleman, whose name you might have heard. If you've heard about emotional intelligence, you probably have heard. Dan Goleman wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence, and the subtitle was Why It Might Matter More Than IQ. In any case, Dan included some of the work that Peter and Jack had done. And one Dan, who was an amazing writer and a really, really brilliant thinker and an excellent speaker, when he wrote his book, it caught fire. It got enormous amount of public attention. And it landed up creating the start of an adventure in this new unknown territory of emotional abilities. And what do I mean by emotional abilities? Now, what Peter and Jack wrote about is really, really interesting. And so let me take a few minutes and just explain again, if you haven't ever heard me talk before and you're just tuning in for the first time, or you may have heard this before. If you're a regular listener, you probably have. But it's worth repeating, because when Peter and Jack wrote about emotional abilities, it was different than what everybody else was saying about emotional abilities. So I'll tell you what I mean. Emotions have been with us since forever, right? I mean, Darwin first talked about an emotional system as part of our survival mechanism, that our emotions, warn us, protect us, inform us. Emotions, he said, was like data, like thought, only different. It was an emotion that would alert us to when to be fearful, when there was an injustice happening, and when to be angry, when to be sad, when we lost something of consequence, a loved one, or a very desirable object of some kind. So Darwin talked about it that way. But we could have said a long time ago that emotion is just something that we always are feeling. But one of the things that Jack and Peter discovered was that there are some unique abilities around emotions, and they identified 4 branches. 2 they considered experiential. The first is the ability to identify or perceive how someone is feeling. Now think about that for a minute. You're looking at me, you're listening to me. If you're listening to the radio, you're just hearing me. If you're watching me on YouTube, you're seeing me as well as hearing me, and you're feeling something. Now, it may not be a strong feeling. It might be a feeling of disinterest. It might be a feeling of curiosity. You might be actually highly engaged at some level. But whatever it is, you're feeling something. But if it's a kind of a low-key feeling, you're probably not paying attention at all to it. If you're really interested and intrigued, then you're probably aware that you're feeling something strong. But to me, feelings are like when you take a breath. If I say to you, focus on your breathing, you'll start to pay attention to your breathing. But chances are you weren't focused on your breathing before I said that. Unless that breathing was labored. You ran a mile or more or less, but you ran and you're breathing really heavy. Or you ran up a flight of stairs and you're breathing heavy. But you notice you're breathing because it's labored. And so you're thinking about it. But if we're just breathing, if we're just feeling, we're not thinking about it, it's just happening. If we're having positive, pleasant feelings, we're probably not thinking about our feelings either. We might be smiling and notice that we seem happy if we happen to see a mirror, or we see other people smiling and our lips curl up because we're happy, they're happy, and we'll notice perhaps. But most of the time when we're focused on our feelings, it's because something is wrong, or we're confused, we're worried, we have a decision to make, and it's a consequential decision, and we don't know what to choose. Or we have a tough conversation we have to have with someone. We know we have to have it, but we're worried that it'll escalate. Or we're worried that we haven't seen our children in quite some time, because we're afraid to go see them because we're older and we're worried that we might get sick. And if we did get sick, how would they feel if they thought they infected us? So there's so many things that we think about before we might go and see our children. And yet other people may not have those thoughts. They may just say, life is what it is. What's going to happen is going to happen. A lot of people get this virus and they don't die, so I'm not going to worry so much about it. People take risk at different levels. And I don't want to say somebody's wrong or somebody's right because of the choice they make on something like this. If it's my own family members, I'll encourage them to do what I think is the right thing to do. If it's friends, same. I'll probably say, gee, I wouldn't do that if I were you. I'm worried about you. I care about you. You sure you want to go to that party with those people? Is that okay to do? To challenge somebody else and how they feel? Not sure. I feel a responsibility, if I care about you, say I care about you, and to share how I'm feeling about what you're doing, if I think you might be putting yourself in harm's way. One of the things that's about to happen in our world is we're going to have an election. And that election is something that is worrying me. I think we'll survive whoever gets into office, but I worry about how polarized we are. I've seen protests turn to violence, and it's scary. I've seen people go out with long guns and handguns to actually protect others who are out peacefully protesting and end up shooting one another. I've not seen this personal close-up, I want to be clear. I've just seen this on television. I worry that this is only going to get worse. I'm not sure how to stop it. I do feel as though I'm working to try and stop it. I do some work on a cultural level as well as this kind of work on an individual level. I hope I'm reaching each of you who are listening and asking you to think about what can you do in the way of being kind to other people? What can you do to really listen to someone else who disagrees with you, to try to understand why they might feel the way they do, without judging them harshly, without feeling like they want to attack them? So as I talk to you about this, as I ask you to consider what you might do going forward, I want you to consider all that you might have learned here about the emotion roadmap, which says, how are you feeling? How do you want to feel? What can you do to feel the way you want to feel? What would be ideal for you to feel, and how can you create that? And for others that you care about, what can you do to help them feel? What would be ideal for them to feel? How can you do that? So what I'd like to do right now is I want to change to a recording that I did a little while ago with one of my colleagues and friends, David Caruso, because I think it's really an excellent guide for how to handle the emotions you're experiencing. And the challenges that we all face going forward is, how do we talk to people who have different political opinions than we do? How do we not judge somebody as wrong and awful because they don't agree with what we think to be the best choice or the right thing to do? So as we go forward into the November election and we deal with the aftermath of the uncertainty about whether it was fair, whether the person who we thought should have been elected was elected or wasn't elected, we're going to have to try as a nation, as a country, as family, as friends, to do better getting along. And so I hope that the message you get from David and I talking is one where you really think about how you're feeling and how you really want to feel. And how about those other people who you say you love? Show it. Show that you love them. Don't be judgmental. Be understanding. Be compassionate. Be empathic. If they're not feeling the way you want them to feel, and if you're not feeling the way you want to feel, think about what's ideal for you both to feel ideal. What would be ideal for you to feel? And see if you can get there. I hope so. I think a lot depends on how good we are at managing our own emotions these days for our own inner peace and for peace around the planet. So I wish you the best of luck with this. And I wish you the best of success with it. You'll need luck and success to keep your relationships intact, I think, after this election. But we're capable of so much more. We're all capable of taking that wheel and controlling how we feel. And it's time to put those skills into action. So I'm going to close now, and then you'll see the film with David and I talking. If you could talk a little bit about their model and how you've worked with the ability-based model and how it's distinct in the field, I'd appreciate that as well.
You know, I do a lot of training of these skills, and people say, you do soft skills training. And my immediate reply is, no, I don't actually do soft skills training. It's hard skills, right? These are abilities. As you said, it's an intelligence. And, you know, first of all, what is it? It's the ability to read people, to know how you feel and how others are feeling. And on a radio show, it's tone of voice. It's what we say. It's the words we use. How is Chuck feeling? What about your audience? You know, how are they feeling right now? Then the second ability is, how do these feelings impact you? How we feel impacts how you think, what you think about, how you make decisions. Whether you're aware of it or not, it still impacts it. And then you begin to reflect and say, all right, well, I'm feeling a little anxious right now, perhaps. Why is that? To understand why we are feeling this way and other people. And then finally, how do we manage these emotions? Let's say right now, and by the way, this is true, I'm slightly anxious in our conversation because I want this to go well. That anxiety is focusing me on details. It's kind of helpful. I understand why. You know, I want this to go well. I don't want to waste your time or that of your listeners. And so my goal now is to manage my anxiety. So it's kind of like that, you know, I have a bit of an edge, but I can't let it get too high because then it'll just distract me too much. So that's the model. And I think it is a little unique in a couple of ways. Hard skills related to intelligence, not its opposite. You can teach skills and train them. But also what we just did, that model, you call it your roadmap, and you really helped develop this, right? How do you apply this? What's the value? And these four abilities, hopefully people will remember them, or at least part of it. So when they walk into any situation, they think, all right, how am I feeling? How about the other person, a family member, a student, a teacher? How is it impacting their thinking? Why are they feeling this way? How might they react if I speak about this issue? And how would I manage my emotions and that other person's emotions to achieve our goal? It's not terribly complicated to remember, but what I found over the years is I have yet to meet someone who does this well on a consistent basis in real time under stressful conditions, right? That's the challenge. We all do this, and everybody listening to your show, they're probably saying, yeah, I do this. I do it as well. But think about those four criteria, you know, do it really well on a consistent basis in real time under highly stressful conditions. So that's the model, and I think that's why it's interesting and really super helpful.
Well, that leads us to the next part of what I want to really talk about, because the model for me is really rich in helping people during crisis, right? Because lots of people are in very stressful situations now. Lots of people are feeling really anxious. I think, Mark Brackett, who's a colleague and friend of both of ours, he's just came up with a study that showed that 95% of Americans are feeling depressed and overwhelmed right now with what's happening to them. 5% are somehow managing to feel okay. It'd be interesting to look at the 5 and see what's going on for them. But a lot of us are feeling that same anxiety, not just about, a particular event, but just being in our homes, being isolated. Not, for me, it's about with my grandchild. I have a grandchild that lives nearby, and we saw him the other day because we
we weren't even going over there, but now we're keeping the distance. And so we're all kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit, I think, right now. But he couldn't hug us. And that was one of the most emotionally painful things, was to be around him and not being able to reach in, pick him up and hold him. He was trying to throw me a ball, and they kept him behind a fence so he wouldn't run up to us, and he couldn't throw the ball over the fence, and I couldn't touch it anyway. So, I'm trying to manage my own emotions while I'm going through that. And now it's kind of fun. We went to see them the other day. We dropped off some bread my wife made for them. And even that, can you give somebody something that you've touched and handled and bring into their house? But we saw him at the door. But he's used to seeing us in his smartphone, in my daughter's smartphone. So we were on a smartphone call with 3 daughters and ourselves, and also we were at the door. Now he's looking at the smartphone and he's looking at us in the door. And it was so funny because we're waving to him and he's looking at us, and then he looks at the phone and waves back. It was sort of like a magical moment for him, because here we were in the phone and we're at the door at the same time. So we're trying to manage, all of us, I think, are struggling with how do we manage our relationships at home. I did a show about dealing with the coronavirus the other day. And I put a picture of Barbara and I, my wife and I, up on the public radio exchange where I posted the show. And it allows me to put a caption. I said, "Together now more than ever before," because we're together so much right now that I was struck by a meme I saw on I think on social media someplace. And it was a man looking very stern-faced sitting beside his wife, who was extremely tense looking. And she said to him, "Will you stop blinking so loudly?" And I think that's sort of the level people are at. And as much as I'd like to think I've learned a lot, having worked with you and done this work over all these years, I still make mistakes around this stuff, especially just like you said, when you're under stress and you want to do it consistently. I mean, I'm good most of the time with this, but every once in a while, it's getting to me too. And I act out in an inappropriate way, and then hopefully recover as quick as I can. But it's hard for people. So I said I'd ask you, just any thoughts you're having about your own personal reactions to what's going on, but any thoughts about how what we know about the science of emotional intelligence might be helpful to folks.
Yeah, so the model is really super helpful, which is, first of all, how am I feeling? And ask yourself that. I've, for the last 4 or 5 years, have been taking the "how are you" question very seriously. When I was in the office and not social distancing, people would walk by in the hallway, they say, "Hey, how are you?" And I would stop and I'd look at them and I'd actually begin to answer. And it's actually incredibly uncomfortable for people, because it's usually not a question. So I would start there. I would start with, recognizing, well, right now I am a little anxious or depressed. Or I find this actually even more interesting, which is a lot of people I still talk to and I ask how they are in a way that invites a real answer. And for many people, many of my colleagues, I'm doing well, which I find interesting, and what's their worldview. So I think you have to allow that. You have to allow people to express, yeah, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I'm not sleeping at night, I'm worried about my health, that of my children, that of the planet, and things like that. But because you don't want them to suppress that feeling. You remember the demonstrations we would do, right? So emotional suppression, like, "Hey, I'm not anxious, I'm not angry," that really doesn't work. It suppresses your display, but it wears away at you, and it's corrosive. And, doesn't work. So what does work? One of the best strategies, you've just talked about it, are the relationships we have. Unfortunately, they now have to be moved to a virtual platform. Not being able to hug your grandchild, that's really difficult.
Right.
But it sounds like you've also been really successful at maintaining relationships, albeit virtually. So I would focus on that, relationships, whether it's email or FaceTime, virtual meetings. I think you said in our conversation the other day that you have virtual meetings with your children and grandchildren. Right? I think that's fabulous. It's not the same as being in person. Although recently with different holidays, many people told me that their recent holidays, religious holidays where family usually gets together, were the best ever. And I asked, well, why is that? So, well, we got to see everybody virtually, but I didn't have to clean my house. I didn't have to cook, didn't have to do all that shopping for 20 people. And thankfully, I didn't have to clean up for 5 hours later. So I would say focus on relationships. That's the key. Diet, exercise, all the classic stuff is really important. But that takes time. So the classic strategies are things like self-talk. What do you say to yourself? Classic relaxation techniques, that one deep breath. A lot of times it sounds pretty goofy to some people, but it's not. I mean, it's really powerful. Just if you want to reduce that anxiety, it's that one deep breath and hold it. You don't have to be into yoga or meditation or, just that one physiological technique works really, really well. And then with other people, one of the most powerful strategies is validating them. It's a technique from DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which basically is around, if you have someone who expresses a fear and you think, well, that's silly. It's not to them. It's not, it's their reality. And it's so invalidating to say things like, hey, you shouldn't feel that way. You're lucky. You're lucky to have the life you lead. Well, that person doesn't feel all that lucky. So the simple phrase is, I can see how someone might feel that way.
I know people in thinking about how to be helpful to somebody else wants to tell them how to feel and why they should feel that way. And I've seen it, you see it a lot with people who are really trying to be empathic and trying to be supportive and caring. And yet it sort of almost has a counter effect where it just, of course I know I want to feel that way, but I don't. And they don't necessarily say that, but it just makes them kind of retreat and not want to even talk about how they're feeling. And, so one of the things that strikes me in this whole concept of my radio show was about, and this is what's so powerful about the model too, that I like so much about what you and Jack and Peter have worked on all these years is the idea that what was exciting to me when I first learned about the model was the idea that you can have a certain emotion that's useful to a particular task. And if you're feeling an emotion that's aligned with that task, that's great. But a lot of times we aren't. So if we're stuck at home and we're starting to feel anxious or tense, and that's not helpful. So one of the things is, asking ourselves, where's the feeling originating from? And is there some other way to change that feeling? And if not, is there some other way to meet the need than something inappropriate that I might do, without thinking? The idea of planning emotionally how I want to feel is a really powerful part of this model that I've really used to full advantage. In this idea of the emotion roadmap, when you first asked me, how do I help people with these concepts, I began to think about those series of questions. And I thought, well, if what I'm feeling, and this is true about a lot of smart people, when you're stuck and you're really unable to problem solve, and yet you're a really good critical thinker, it's almost, in my experience, almost always something emotional that's going on, either inside you or with somebody else that you have to deal with, one or more people. And if you can ask yourself what would be ideal to feel, as soon as people start to think like that, and they come up with something that's more ideal to feel, I find people's brains race to figure that out. How do I get there? How do I feel that? The idea of trying to be helpful to people. You talked about tone of voice. I'm trying to get people on this show to call in with problems they're having in their lives that are pretty risky to share on the air. I mean, what would make somebody feel like they could call somebody they've never met before and assume they're going to get some help and put what's really worrying them, maybe for weeks or months or even years sometimes, on a radio show? So I've got to somehow, through tone of voice, generate enough trust in somebody to feel like this is worth it. Somehow this guy's making me feel like I want to talk to him and share what I've got because he seems like he's able to help other people. Maybe he can help me. So that's what I'm trying to do, even in this. And some of the things you just said, I think, David, everybody who's listening to that are going to get some ideas maybe that they didn't have before. And hopefully that's, even if it's the single breath idea. Yeah, it's just simple things sometimes. And yet when you do them, they're powerful.
Well, that's the key, Chuck, which is you can know these things, but if you don't do it, there's no positive impact on your life. It's sort of saying, I exercise, really critical to mental health. I went for a jog about 2 years ago, or another way to look at it, I like analogies, and something I've been telling people in the last few years, which they seem to get, some people do, which is I have very low cholesterol. because every day I take this giant pill, right? And when I don't take it, it triples. I'm a cholesterol factory, right? So I know this, and it's not something I can take once a year or once, every now and then. It's an everyday thing. And so the end result is that I have super low cholesterol. The same thing with unwanted anxiety and sadness and things like that, which is, it's got to be an everyday thing. You can't just say, yeah, I got a good night's sleep 3 weeks ago, or I went outside for an hour, it was about 2 months ago, and so forth. Or I called a friend, or we had a virtual happy hour. When was that? It's got to be, if not an everyday practice, it's got to be frequent. So otherwise, it's just not going to work. And I think that's the key. So people shouldn't use this to beat themselves up like, oh gosh, I'm not doing any of those things. Instead, it's find one thing. That's all. Find one thing and try it. And then when you don't, as you mentioned, that no one does this well all the time. I don't. I certainly don't. And that's where a good and honest and heartfelt apology comes in, which is, I'm really sorry. I messed that up. I'm really sorry. I tried, but I failed, and I am really sorry. Just don't apologize if you don't mean it. That's the key, as we all know. So find something that you can do, and don't beat yourself up. Don't add this to your to-do list to increase your anxiety. Use it to decrease it, and give yourself a break. It's actually one of the best strategies too is cognitive reappraisal. This is working with others, and what I thought in the last few years again is that I think most of us act like a jerk at times. We say things we regret. We do things that we're not proud of, but very few of us are jerks. Right? And I think I like that distinction, which is but when I say something badly or hurt someone's feelings, it's because I'm probably under other kinds of stress that I'm unaware of, and it leaks out. It's not that I don't think I'm a quote unquote bad person, nor do I think there are a lot of quote unquote bad people out there. But we're under stress and we say things and do things we don't mean. So the reappraisal is, don't say that person is a jerk. Switch it around and say, gee, I wonder what's going on in his life. Like what's actually happening in his life or her life on a daily basis? No idea. Is it possible that individual is under stress or is having a tough day? And I think that really kind of really decreases our own irritation, annoyance at others and things like that. So basically it's a way of just cut people a break, give them some slack and have some patience with me and with the world around us.
It's really interesting you say that. I published an article in a journal a couple of years ago about emotional disabilities, and not about emotionally disturbed people. That's different. It was the idea when I began. You remember when learning disabilities were an unknown? I mean, we're both old enough, I think, it used to be that if somebody didn't read as a young kid, they just weren't smart and they got put into the bluebird section or something. And yet teachers were struggling with the idea that, certain kids belong in that section because that's their ability level. But some of these kids are really smart, but they're still not reading. So something else is happening here. And that's when people first began to think, well, maybe it's something to do with how we're teaching them and they don't learn the same way. And they don't have the same abilities that most other kids seem to have. And yet they're smart, but maybe smart in different ways. And so the whole concept and idea of learning disabilities came into play. So having worked with this mesquite for a long time and measured a lot of people's abilities and realized that some people really, I remember the old expression, garbage in, garbage out about computer systems. So I began to think that what if the ability to perceive how you're making somebody else feel doesn't exist for certain people? And maybe the ability to manage difficult emotions on an ongoing basis is really low in certain people. And so when somebody is in a house with somebody nonstop all the time, and I know a lot of people are having their family members move in with them right now, and you think that somebody has a bad attitude. Sometimes the article was about was maybe it's a bad attitude, but it's also the possibility that maybe it's an ability. They really can't do this well. And because they can't do this well, cut them some different slack and be more empathetic, and probably life will be a bit better. As soon as you take the judgment out of your head about why it's happening, you're still going to feel bad being around it, but you won't feel the same way as you would if you thought it was just because they didn't care how you felt, when you understand they were struggling so much themselves, or they didn't also realize, they didn't have the capacity to realize how other people were responding to them. And so I began to think about, at some point, David, I think we'll be calling things, I think we'll recognize there are emotional disabilities out there. And only through this model, I think, can we learn more about that, or models maybe that build on this at a later time. But to me, it was like a real discovery. I presented it in the consortium, just this idea, and nobody really thought about it. But it was like, hey, that makes some sense. And maybe because we often will be judgmental about somebody else and how they're behaving towards us without thinking about, I wonder if that's purposeful or not. And if it's not purposeful, it's a game changer in terms of how I see it. So that's another thing to consider. The people in the house with you may not have the same abilities as you have. So when you see them not managing well, you might want to be more forgiving and not assume that it's just because they have bad attitudes. It's just another thought I had about this.
Yeah, I think it's a good thought. I mean, along those lines is also, are you expressing how you're feeling? Or do you expect people around you to be a mind reader, right? Which I see happen a lot. So maybe that other person is struggling to perceive how you feel. On the other hand, are we doing a really good job expressing our own feelings? Or, it goes back to the how are you question. If someone says, how you doing? Say, good, fine. Right? Like, what does that mean? Instead, you can actually be a little disarming and simply say, today, I don't know. I mean, I'm really, really anxious or very worried and so forth. So, yeah, I think it's a great analogy, which is maybe they're not picking up on it. But what's our role, right? Are we expressing it? I know I don't always do that. And I think, whether as partners or parents and things, we also sometimes intentionally don't share how we're feeling with others.
Right.
Because, right? We don't want them to worry about us. We're supposed to take care of others. Caretakers, parents, and managers, and leaders, and supervisors, and teachers. We do what we do to take care of others. So I don't want them to worry about me. On the other hand, if I was a little impatient with you this morning, because I do have my worries and concerns. So I would also think about that.
One of the things that I encourage people to do on this other show that I had to listen really deeply at levels that you might not under normal circumstances. And I just read someplace, one great question is when somebody's starting to talk to you is instead of asking we have a tendency often to want to solve everybody's problems, and it gets problematic when people don't like the answer we have for how to solve the problem. But anyway, one of the things that I found was if you instead of wanting to say anything other than to listen, just asking people, tell me more, and tell me more until you're really finished, and really just hear them out and have no other agenda. Kind of push away whatever thoughts you're having about what you need to do next. And oftentimes in conversations at home, I'll be busy with lots of things, and so I'll start to listen to a story, but I get a bit anxious about wanting to move on from the story. And now I'm saying, you know what? I got more time. Now, not everybody does, by the way. I mean, some people are really struggling around the time issue, but I have time, and so I'm trying harder to make sure that I really fully listen. And again, it's just to my wife right now, or on the phone when one of my kids calls. Just make sure I really, don't put my own thoughts as a priority, and just until they're done. When you get the head nod that somebody really feels heard, that they okay. And then if there's a problem, I also suggested strategies for that, because as a therapist years ago, it was pretty easy to understand what somebody needed to do different, I thought. And usually I was pretty good at this. So I would have the right answers for them, but I found that if you gave the right answer too early, it chased them away. They became defensive. They weren't ready to hear it. And then sometimes I wouldn't have the right answer. And then they'd want to be argumentative with me, And so I think most of us, a lot of us like to solve problems. So if somebody comes to you with an issue, at the end, you want to tell them what to do about it. And what I've done instead, and encourage people to do, is simply just think about, instead of offering a solution, Ask people what they're thinking about doing or what they've already tried. Because whatever's obvious to you is probably something they probably have considered and dismissed for one reason or another, if they don't find that to be the useful solution that you think it could be. And then ask, are you thinking about anything else? And if they got nothing, then you can say, would you like me to offer some thoughts I'm having about it? And ask permission. And then if they like what you have to say, great. If they've got something they're thinking about and you like that, you reinforce that. And then you avoid lots of arguments, and it's really helpful. And I think, again, you want to be thinking about these things when you're in place with somebody for a long time. And it's not normal, and you've got to create sort of a new normal. And so those are some thoughts that I had that I thought would be helpful to folks.
It's extremely helpful. It's extremely helpful. Yeah, but again, you have to do those things.
Yeah, like exercise.
Yeah, and you have to have patience. You have to do, like, bite your own tongue, which is don't interrupt and listen.
Right. Yeah. Not easy to do all the time.
No, it's really hard. Yeah.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.